Hello, this is Davine Dial with WPVM in Asheville, North Carolina, and I have Bennett Cobb with me today, who has been in radio over 50 years, which is pretty incredible because I love talking to people who have been in it that long. So here's some information about Bennett. He's a public relations specialist for IPAWS, the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System at FEMA in Washington, D.C. He began his radio career at KPFT Pacifica Radio in Houston, Texas, and worked at 6 additional stations in Houston and Austin and in Boulder, Colorado, where he also worked in broadcast engineering. As a business and technology reporter, he covered the FCC for 20 years for trade publications. Bennett is a volunteer at WERA in Arlington, Virginia, which many of us on this roundtable are very familiar with. And he's on Facebook and can be found dispensing sage advice to community radio stations, whether they ask for it or not. Welcome, Bennett. How are you today?
Thanks, delighted. Delighted to be with you. It's after a couple of cold days, we're having a lovely day here in the DC area, and I've been out wearing my KPFT hat.
Oh yeah, it's very attractive on you.
That's where our story begins, I guess.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, so recently at our roundtable, Pacifica Roundtable for station managers, we the subject of safety and the bombing of the stations in Houston came up, and I remembered that you had said you were there. So, so burning ears want to know all about it.
Well, I was a pre-teen volunteer at KPFT in Houston, my hometown. I was not present. No one was present at the transmitter when it was bombed, thank heaven. But obviously it had an enormous financial impact, psychological impact, as well as physical impact on KPFT and on the community radio movement. Pacifica Foundation had a long history of being associated with the left, and that was what attracted the attackers. KPFT had not been on the air for very long in 1970 when members of the Ku Klux Klan came and dynamited the station. The remote transmitter was in a rural area outside the city limits of Houston. The KPFT studio was in an office building in downtown Houston, where I just love to hang out as a volunteer and answer the phone, stuff envelopes, and do whatever they asked me to do. I was just fascinated with radio at that time, and we can come back to that in the context of security practices as well. So when the signal suddenly dropped and no explanation could be found at the studio, they took a trip out to the transmitter in Stafford, Texas, and I'm going to try to share my screen here and show you what they found. Can you see this, Davine?
Yes, yes.
This is a photograph taken from a ways up the tower. This is the full power Collins transmitter blown apart by dynamite. Mike August was the station manager at the time. That's him in the upper left area, turning his head. Mike is still involved in community radio in Texas. Let me bring up the next image here. What a complete mess. But incredibly, they pulled things back together and raised money and rebuilt the transmission site in a concrete bunker that was designed to withstand attack, but a full power transmitter like this generates heat, and it had to be vented to the outside, and so there was a small opening, which is where the Klan guys came back, piled more dynamite on this opening, covered it with sandbags, and blew the force of the blast back into the transmitter, and the station was bombed for a second time.
So the sandbags would force the impact down instead of up, so it could do the most damage.
Exactly. And of course, for quite some time, there was seemingly no action on this case. And to understand this, we have to see that we have to understand that the KKK had a long history in Texas. And in fact, the Klan, for many years in the South, had extensive penetration into public safety and really government at all levels, including, of all things, the Postal Service. The chief of police of the city of Houston said publicly he didn't care for this station and didn't know why the FCC allowed KPFT to be on the air. The sheriff said much the same thing. There was a great deal of suspicion that the law enforcement was not making much progress. But when the station was bombed the second time, people stood up and took more attention, including others in the broadcasting community who wondered that they might be next. In fact, it turned out that the team from the Klan had threatened another station in Houston with a bomb threat, a top 40 station that wasn't involved in any kind of progressive politics or controversy. This is a photograph of a Houston police officer with the police department emblem on the car, wearing his Klan hood. This is not a fake image. It became known that there were plenty of Klansmen in the Houston police and elsewhere in Texas police and sheriff's departments. And this helped to explain why the authorities were dragging their feet on finding the perpetrators. Eventually, the public pressure from various sides got the case moving, and several men were found to be involved. The FBI had an informant in the Texas Klan, and this informant identified the ringleader, a man named Hutto. And in fact, these guys were actually arrested on their way to California to bomb KPFA in Berkeley and KPFK in Los Angeles. And thank heaven that they were stopped before that. Hutto was convicted. I believe he died in prison. And something a little bit ironic about that is that KPFT has a long history of programming for prisoners and helping the families of incarcerated persons. I don't know if he lived long enough, but if he'd had a radio in prison, he might have been able to listen to the radio station he helped to try to destroy. This is KPFT's building in the Montrose area of Houston, where they moved after the downtown address. And about 5 years ago, they inaugurated a brand new all solid state full power transmitter. That's the station manager, Dwayne Bradley, with it. And so this was just a terrific thing. They were able to raise money with a fundraising program called Transmission Possible. That's where I got that cool hat. So although KPFT is owned by the Pacifica Foundation, it's always been a Texas-oriented station with Texas artists and Texas culture, and identifies itself as Houston's community station. And although I'm in Virginia here and no longer associated with KPFT, I still listen online, and I'm very proud of what they've done at that station.
So when we had our pre-recording kind of conversation, you mentioned some tips on getting, I guess, to a more favorable place with your local law enforcement, so that perhaps if something terrible happened, that they might see you not as the enemy.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea for, at a minimum, to have your local authorities know where your radio station is and to cultivate, if you can, good relationships with your local government. Here in Arlington, Virginia, our LPFM actually houses its transmitter in the county 911 emergency radio room. And there is a close relationship there with the county government. Uh, Before I move to some possible measures you can take for safety and security, I do want to answer the question some people may have, which is why did the Ku Klux Klan target this radio station? They had been targeting any type of leftist organization, including a progressive newspaper in Houston called Space City. And by all accounts, they had protection from the Houston police for these actions. Of course, the Klan was known throughout American history for church burnings, cross burnings, kidnappings, lynchings, beatings. But in the 70s, they sort of expanded their portfolio from white supremacy to socialism and communism. And even though KPFT had not been on the air for very long, and a lot of it was broadcasting music, they targeted Pacifica as some kind of a communist operation. This is what they did. So this led us to a conversation about paying attention to station safety and security, especially in this polarized environment that we have today, with people allowing themselves to disbelieve actual reality. As we speak, in my home state of Texas, they are trying very hard to pass legislation to make it much harder to vote. We've had this attack on the Capitol, and so people are very polarized, and it's not outside the possibility, the realm of possibility that if a community radio station aired political content, controversial content, or people who do not otherwise have a voice, that, heaven forbid, they might be targeted. And of course, community radio stations are in the public eye. They're not hiding, they're broadcasting. Hopefully they're known and understood and valued by the community. So that's why I think it's worth thinking about risk reduction or risk management at your station. Access control is one of the things that we discussed. And, as a kid interested in radio, a buddy of mine and I really enjoyed visiting radio stations. We wanted to start a career in radio when we were in high school. And one of our favorite tactics, if we didn't get invited ahead of time, was simply to go and find the back door of a radio station and wait until somebody exited, and then stroll in, trying to pretend that we belonged there. And this actually worked. We never got thrown out, but this brings to mind the issue of access control. So I believe at WPVM, you've instituted some electronic controls. Is that right?
Yeah, we have a keypad on the door that I issue when someone jumps through all of the necessary hoops to be part of the station, they're assigned a door code, so that's what they use to get in. But the building that we're in also has an access card that anytime, so the building is open during the week between 10 and 4:30, but the rest of the time you need to use that access card. So we have double, and recently there was a new FCC update about where your transmitter is and where your antenna is, and that it has to be locked to get there. We're fortunate enough to have our antenna on our roof here, but it takes two sets of keys to get up into that equipment room where the transmitter is, and then another key access to get out there to where the antenna is. So we're not out in a field in the countryside somewhere. I feel like we are very fortunate because of that.
Many stations do lease space on commercial towers,
Mhm,
and the FCC is often concerned about maintenance of that area. The tower needs to be registered with the commission.
mhm,
There needs to be a sign on the fencing. It has to be some security barrier there. The tower has to be painted and lighted if that is one of your requirements. And should you ever be inspected by the commission, they may be interested in whether the tower is being maintained properly and
mhm,
whether it's the lighting especially is working.
mhm.
Obviously, this is for aviation safety, and it's a
Mhm.
subject that they have no sense of humor about.
Right,
Um,
rightfully so.
Um, if you incidentally, it may seem far from your mind, but I do really encourage stations of any type to be prepared for an FCC inspection, which can happen when you least expect it. They don't make appointments. You cannot ask them to wait or to come back another day. And they're not going to be snooping into your DJs or your song lyrics. They're mainly interested in physical things like we just mentioned, the antenna, if there's requirements there. They want to know if your emergency alert system device is on, is working and receiving the tests and you're forwarding the tests. And if you have a station log, which is a technical log relating to maintenance. So if there's issues in perhaps you're not receiving the EAS tests, that has to be investigated and put in the station log. And anything affecting maintenance or unexpected off-air transmitter issues, anything like that has to be in the station log. Also, if you received requests from political candidates who want to appear on the station, there are special provisions for keeping a record of those requests and what you did about those requests. I recommend that the station have some sort of a note or sign on your front door that says this is a radio station, you know, what your station is, and in case of emergency, what number to call in case there's a fire or something and the station's unattended. That would be very helpful to have. I'm a big believer in backups in case there's some kind of an incident, again, a fire or loss of a power or loss of a server, that you have your station records, your music, your programs on digital files on a server or your automation system that is backed up elsewhere. And so there are a couple of ways of doing this, actually three ways. I recommend all three. First of all, you need to have physical disks, drives that are backing up your content and stored elsewhere in the station. This is a natural. You don't want to be caught with your whole station content on somebody's laptop that gets stolen or dropped, or you turn it on and you find it doesn't boot and there goes your programming. You want to keep that on reliable storage. Next is backing up to offsite cloud services. This is services like Dropbox or Google Drive, Amazon Drive, or iCloud, or other Backblaze, other backup services that will store your content and help you to recover in the event you need that. Very, very important. And you can automate that process. But the third part of this, which I think is especially useful as well as fairly inexpensive, is to back up your files to a server at someone's home who is associated with the station.
Is that the Synology one? Is that the one you sent me an interest a link to yesterday?
Yes.
Synology unit.
So Synology is one of the brands of network attached storage, NAS, which are simply file servers. They can have one or more hard drives in them. And the Synology NAS and other brands contain software that will back themselves up over the internet to an identical unit. It could be placed in another location, someone's home, and you don't have to pay any annual fees for that. You're just backing up one unit to another. I'll show you a picture of one of those units. This is a Synology NAS. This particular one contains 2 drives. They're not intimidating devices. They're not costly devices. You have a lot of choice, and it's a great way to store your music and store your station records and so forth. You simply attach these to your Ethernet network in your facility. It does require some IT knowledge to set up. It is also possible to use these devices remotely over the internet, but that requires some attention to security so that people do not hack into the device and find it and try to disturb it over the internet. But yes, I do recommend the Synology. I've used about 12 different NAS brands, and I happen to like this one, especially because they're so cheap.
So give us a ballpark figure for something that would be adequate for a small station.
Well, I think you're going to be spending less than $300 all total, the unit and the drive. But you can put in 1 drive, 2 drives, 10 drives, solid state drives. You have a vast range of choices, as well as how you set the drives up so that they, in case one drive were to fail, the others are still online and contain your data. For IT people, this term is known as RAID, which is redundant array of inexpensive drives. And we're getting into the weeds, the IT weeds a little bit, but your IT people will know what that means.
Yeah,
If
and
you,
so let me ask you about the hard drives. Approximately how many terabytes does like a under $300 Synology, Synology unit will hold? How many terabytes of hard
that's
drive?
based entirely on the size of the drives that you stick in the device. So you can get a terabyte drive, you can get several terabytes. It all depends on your data needs. If you get a unit that's got multiple bays for drives, whether it's Synology or other brands,
Uh-huh.
or you build it, or you build it yourself, that's possible too. You can just add drives to it. The reason I happen to like this one is because it comes with so many useful applications and automatic backups. Excuse me. Synology itself operates a cloud backup service called C2, which is very inexpensive. It'll also back up to Dropbox and many other services, in addition to backing itself up to another Synology unit that could be connected to someone's internet service at home.
Well,
So
for those of us just getting started on understanding this external storage of our important things, maybe in the future we could do a little interview about that, or have
maybe so.
some sort of little tutorial. I think that would be very helpful. It would certainly be helpful to me. So yeah, so go ahead. I interrupted you there. So go ahead. You were on RAD or RAID?
RAID, R-A-I-D.
Yeah, RAID.
Uh,
That's where you were.
that's right. And so that's what that is called. But the system is called network attached storage. I'm concerned, for example, if a station has all of its content on an automation system, what happens if that automation system goes down?
Like
Do,
station playlist?
sure, or
Yeah,
any of
yeah,
the
yeah.
many others. And music is one issue that's going to take up a lot of data. Your station records is another one, and then your audio programming.
Mhm.
So this is something for the management to think about. Um, so these are just some basic measures: access control, backups, signage, knowing who is in the station, and hopefully propagating a culture of caring for the facility, caring for the security of the station, and supporting it. And I think that when that culture comes from the top, it will spread through a station, and people will value it and treasure it.
Yeah, I personally consider protecting the station and the license. That's my number one job.
Absolutely. And sometimes there's a culture at stations that, with regard to the license, that's an FCC matter, and the FCC is bureaucrats in Washington, and we don't need to do what they tell us, and so on. And it's simply a reality that while the list of regulations that apply to LPFM stations and community radio stations is not a long list, it is there.
Mhm.
And we have tremendous freedom in this country with our ability to broadcast through non-commercial stations. So it behooves all of us to know what those rules are, whether it's the technical rules or the ID rules or the station log. People ought to be aware of it.
So just one more question before, and then I want to hear a couple of old radio stories about Lorenzo and attacks on God, or God is mentioned there. So I think I understand from some of the support groups that I follow that some state broadcasting organizations, they will come in and do a check for you. And if you pass that is satisfactory for the FCC, from what I understand. Am I correct on that?
Yes, but there are a few caveats. In general, this is a great service. However, not all state broadcasting associations welcome low power FM.
Right. But when they do, if and when they do,
or community radio stations.
Yes.
So you might want to take advantage of that service, but as far as passing an FCC inspection, there's not many things to be aware of. And you ought to be able to do it on your own, in my view.
Mhm.
But people need to understand that they cannot delay an inspection and they cannot refuse an inspection. One of the things that comes up again and again is that people say, "You're an FCC inspector, show me your search warrant." And this is a misunderstanding of the whole situation. First of all, when you have an FCC license, you have already agreed to follow the FCC rules, which includes allowing the commission to inspect your station.
Mhm.
You can refuse an inspection, tell them to go away. That is itself a violation for which you will have to pay. And that happens all the time. I have been reading the FCC's daily documentation for decades and collecting stories of enforcement cases against stations. And when an enforcement action is levied against a station, especially a non-commercial station, it's usually for stupid reasons, like refusing an inspection. They do not need a search warrant. They are not there to search the premises. They're there to inspect the station, apparatus connected with the station very specifically.
Mhm.
And without that, the United States would not have control of the radio spectrum, which it has. There is an interesting story behind this, which has to do with a specific agreement that you make when you sign that license application. Everybody signs this. A broadcast applicant, an applicant for an amateur radio license, a cellular phone license, a satellite license. And that agreement says that I waive any claim to the radio spectrum as against the power of the United States. This agreement used to be a little bit more interesting. It used to say that I waive any claim to the ether. And it may seem kind of strange, but you have to remember that years ago, it was believed that radio waves were waves in the ether, a mysterious substance that surrounded the world. And supposedly some physicists demonstrated that the ether doesn't exist, but I've heard that in more recent years, people are even questioning that conclusion. Well, but nowadays it is assumed that there is no ether. So the FCC took out that interesting antiquated wording. But the reason for this agreement is in the beginnings of broadcast radio. And a lady preacher, a famous radio preacher, Amy Semple McPherson, who broadcast over the air and refused FCC inspection and said that she doesn't listen to the FCC, she listens to God and has to be on his wavelength. And she was,
isn't that Seventh-day Adventist?
I don't remember exactly what
I
her
think
faith was.
Or Christian Scientist. It's one of the two that I'm associating her name with. Go ahead.
So broadcasters of that era said, well, we're already on the air. We already have this frequency. Go away. And so the FCC was empowered to require that you waive any claim because of previous transmission. So you waive any claim. The United States has the power over the radio spectrum. Broadcasting is a privilege. It's not a right.
Mm-hmm.
For radio and television stations, it's based on your promises to serve the public. And in my opinion, non-commercial stations especially do that every day. So you do not have any out when the commission makes an inquiry. If they write you a letter, you have to respond promptly. I'm familiar with a station in Ohio that got an FCC letter, ignored it, and because it was ignored, the FCC ordered them off the air. Commission doesn't like to have its inquiries not be answered. And the station ignored the command to go off the air. And so this is a long-running legal case with this particular LPFM station in Ohio. We don't know how it's going to turn out. Do not ignore these requests. If the Enforcement Bureau shows up at your door, perhaps as unlikely as that may seem, they carry official identification. They have a special sort of FCC badge. They're usually nice people, unless you're a pirate operator. And you have to let them in. And they're principally going to be interested in the EAS and in your station log, and be satisfied that you have control over the transmitter.
Okay, so tell us about Lorenzo and the repercussions of their story about God.
Hopefully everyone here has at least heard of Lorenzo Wilson Milam, an extraordinary person who sought to start a Pacifica radio station here in Washington, D.C., and was refused at that time. And he just waited and waited for the FCC to act on his application. And he found out the reason for the delay was that Pacifica at that time was considered to be a communist organization. Of course, today we do have WPFW, the Jazz and Justice station here in Washington, D.C., but he could not get a Pacifica station going at that time. And so he went to Seattle, where he started KRAB, a legendary non-commercial station with Jeremy Klansmen, my former boss, wonderful engineer. And he went on to start several other non-commercial stations, KCHU in Dallas, KDNA in St. Louis, and many others, including another station, to overuse a word, legendary, a commercial station, KFAT, KFAT Radio in Gilroy, California, garlic capital of the world. Fin may be in, but fat is where it's at. So KFAT was an amazing station. Also, I think some books and movies have been devoted to that. Now, and to this day, there is a KPHT LP that is carrying on that tradition. Lorenzo was a polio victim. Polio also killed his sister and took away the use of his legs. And he wrote books about disability. And this person who underwent extraordinary suffering, physical suffering, nevertheless contributed so greatly to our communities through community radio. he wrote a book called Sex and Broadcasting, which has nothing to do with sex, but it's a book about starting a community radio station. I highly recommend it. He also authored a book called The Radio Papers, a collection of his writings through his adventures. And I first learned about Lorenzo and Jeremy when I was in a broadcasting program in college at the University of Texas. Somebody loaned me these books of his. And one of the books was called The Petition Against God, which is a bizarre episode in the history of the FCC, the history of broadcasting in the US, that we're still feeling the effects today. Lorenzo and Jeremy felt that granting non-commercial educational radio licenses to churches and religious organizations was a questionable thing, considering the separation of church and state. And they petitioned the FCC to take another look at this and consider whether this was the right thing to continue doing. And the FCC rejected this petition, but the story didn't end there. The news got out to the religious broadcasting community, and it generated millions and millions of protest letters to the FCC long after the petition was denied. The commission had to put out a special brochure, which they had to mail in large quantity, called the FCC and Religious Broadcasting or something like that, pointing out that the petition was declined, that the government does not have the right to tell people they cannot broadcast religion over the air. People who are of various faiths and people who cannot attend church services can enjoy their services over the radio, and everything is fine. But this continued to dog the FCC, and it made clear through the years, Devine, that the FCC did not want to touch religious broadcasting at all. And to this day, probably the majority of low-power FM stations are church or religious licensees. Well, I spent a lot of time at the FCC as a reporter, and one day my old boss, Jeremy, was at the commission, and I said, Jeremy, come with me. And I brought him to the office at the FCC where the long-suffering commission employees answer calls and letters from the public. And I said, do you still get complaints about the petition against God? You know, the Klansmen Milam petition? And they said, do we ever? Every day. They showed us a log of phone calls. Yeah, this is in the 90s. A log of phone calls and messages, people still complaining and asking that the FCC reject this demonic petition. And I said, well, that's Klansmen. So we all had a good laugh, and he wasn't arrested. And that was my FCC story. So if you wonder why the commission, even today, is still very willing to entertain religious broadcasting in all of its conservative display, this may have something to do with it. And Lorenzo wrote a wonderful book about this affair called The Petition Against God. I don't have a copy. I seem to recall it had a lot of pictures of fish in it for some reason. But the book is around on the net. And Lorenzo went on to his reward just a few months ago, I guess. There was a tremendous obituary in the New York Times. And having spent a little bit of time with him was just wonderful to see this extraordinary person, how inspiring he was.
Well, thank you for that radio history, little trip down radio history there. And I'm sure you've got many other stories to tell. And I want to thank you very much, Bennett, for generously sharing the information that you've given us here. I'm sure it's going to be very helpful to many of us out here in community radio land.
I'm going to read one sentence from a great book that I recommend, also besides Lorenzo's books. Steve Post was a famous Pacifica broadcaster from WBAI. He wrote a great book called Playing in the FM Band. I recommend that to anybody connected with Pacifica or any community radio. And there's a sentence in this book talking about how people are attracted to community radio. And it said, there seems to be an invisible antenna which scans the souls of those who come to the station, which looks for people who have not squelched and buried whatever it is that makes them unique. So I hope that characterizes people at WPVM. By the way, I recommend here in closing that everybody visit the WPVM website for a great example of a great station, wonderful content, even dessert recipes. It's a station to emulate. So Daveen, you're doing a great job, you and your team.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been an absolute honor to be able to do this. So Bennett has some links that are going to be included along with this recording for those of you viewing this on the Pacifica Roundtable. And I think we'll be able to put them in the chat, or we'll get those links to you some way. And they're very helpful. So again, Bennett, thank you very much for a great interview.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
All right. Bye-bye.